Welcome, everybody. I'm Cliff Grossner, and I am very pleased to bring to you today another Open Compute Project educational webinar, another one in our series around powering the metaverse. And today we are going to explore a little bit about what might be the metaverse. And I must admit, this is the first time that we've bit off a topic that's so forward-looking in the educational webinar series. And while we don't have a specific project in the OCP working on the metaverse or something called the Metaverse Project, we do have many projects that are working on components and equipment that someday will be part of the metaverse build-out. I want to remind everyone that we are going to be having a live Q&A at the end, so please feel free to enter your questions at any time during the webinar. And also, I would also like to remind you that this is being recorded and will be available on demand post the webinar. So with that, as I move to the sharing the people that are going to be with us on the presentation, I want to let you know that the first time I heard about the metaverse was actually in a science fiction book I read more than 25 years ago, just as the early internet was forming. So it's quite exciting to see that we're now talking about the next rev of a virtual experience, which is much more immersive. And I'll let our speakers talk more about that. So as I said today, I'm Cliff Grossner, and I'm the Vice President Market Intelligence for the Open Compute Project Foundation. We have with us Kuba Stolarski, a research director from IDC who covers data center infrastructure at a general level and some deeper areas as well. We have Chang, Vice President Technical Operations at Inspur, and John Miranda, Senior Director out of the Strategy Office of the Data Center and AI Group at Intel. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Kuba, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the metaverse, what, why, and when. But before I do that, I also want to take you through the agenda. And so here you can see that we're going to talk about the metaverse from IDC's perspective. We're going to look at what transformations are going to be necessary to achieve the metaverse. Then we'll drop into a bit of a discussion about building the metaverse, what's it going to take, and some of the technologies that we're going to have to work on over the next 5, 10, maybe 15 years to get us there. We do have some products that we want to talk about in our product showcase, and then we'll wrap it up with a quick discussion on what is the impact at the enterprise level for the metaverse build out. So with that, as I promised, let me now pass it over to Kuba.
Thank you very much, Cliff, and thanks everybody for joining us today. I do think this is a great topic for discussion. I think I said earlier to my colleagues here that the metaverse is probably a topic where there are no experts at this point, right? Everybody, or a lot of people, have a little bit of a slice of a view of what it might become and what's there now, but it's really a new topic. Now, the concept, as Cliff said, kind of has been around for a few decades, right? So it's been around for a while in science fiction. We've seen it in a bunch of different places, but it's fairly new to the real world, so to speak, no pun intended. But so, what is the metaverse from IDC's point of view, at least? We don't have a concrete definition right now, or a kind of an official definition. So this is probably the closest to a definition that we have at IDC right now. And it's been used, this description has been used by several analysts so far. So, what is it? It's really a concept, not a place, but a concept of this highly immersive blending of immersive environment, which blends physical and digital worlds. It's this idea of this shared concept, shared experience, I guess, between multiple, ideally in the future, a lot of users impacting different areas of work and life. Right, so there's kind of this entertainment and gaming aspect, right, that's already being pursued enthusiastically by a lot of people. But there's also this idea that these digital environments can have some impact and usefulness for the enterprise, right, for commerce. And so, here I've listed some of the use cases and areas of interest that IDC has discussed so far in some of our research, especially in the context of enterprise. Digital twins are probably the most tangible of these topics. They're kind of the most discussed perhaps recently. It's this idea that we can mimic aspects of something in the real world with a digital simulation that allows us to explore and test how it might work or react in the real world. I mean, the applications there for engineering sciences are certainly seem limitless. And some of these other use cases or examples, really kind of areas of business, commerce that might be impacted by various types of immersive metaverse technologies or environments. And again, I want to point out, we often talk about the metaverse as if it's one thing or one place, almost like it's the internet. But really, it's again this concept of creating these digital worlds in which that we can interact with. So we only have one real world, hopefully. Some might differ, some might beg to differ, but there's no clear limit on how many metaverse worlds we can create. Right, it's kind of limited by our own ingenuity and of course the infrastructure that would be required to build these environments. So let's explore a little bit about, since this is really a lot about infrastructure, let's explore a little bit about how that infrastructure might support the metaverse. So, infrastructure meaning servers, compute, storage, networking hardware, that as a market, it's really undergone, excuse me, a lot of changes, kind of a real evolution over the last decade, a little over a decade now. And I want to just spend a little bit of time kind of looking at this visual and explain what this is really saying. So, we've kind of gone from infrastructure being a nice to have, perhaps a discretionary spending item, to something that's really becoming a mission critical kind of backbone of the business type of investment. Perhaps not all of it yet, but an increasing share of what's purchased from within the infrastructure market is becoming critical to the success of somebody's business. So to illustrate that, we have this view of the Great Recession on the left, and how a relatively small change in or decline in GDP triggered this huge drop in infrastructure spending. Right, it was one of the first areas, IT in general, and certainly infrastructure was one of the first areas back then to be cut when budgets were tightened. Then we recovered a bit, of course, in probably about 2010. But that recovery wasn't even across everything within the infrastructure market, right? There's a lot of recovery, a lot of growth in x86 and all-flash arrays, certainly through public cloud deployments. We spent a lot of time, kind of in this last decade after the Great Recession, talking about the third platform, or what we call the third platform. So that's driven by social, mobile, analytic, and cloud, of course, workloads or technologies. We talked about this concept of digital transformation, right? How various functions in business and in life were becoming digitized, right? So leading to concepts like the Internet of Things, right? That's a little bit more recent. And of course, how did that manifest recently, right? When we got into the pandemic, well, you can see we had a GDP decline that was actually significantly bigger from a percentage perspective than what we had during the Great Recession. But infrastructure actually grew within that context, right? We're now more reliant on these third platform digital technologies than we ever have been before, right? We're leveraging these technologies kind of to build the future. And that's kind of where the metaverse comes in, right? We don't have it yet, but looking forward, the metaverse is going to be this platform on which we end up building building the future, building whatever the future use cases we come up with, right? That's not something that we can easily put on the list like I tried to do on the last slide. So let's briefly look at some of this in a little bit more detail, right? So this is the server market. Again, this is growth in the server market. We see marked here where we have the Great Recession, and we have the COVID pandemic, where we actually had a little bit of growth. And actually, if we look at what happened in 2017 and 2018, I didn't mention this before, I didn't have it on the previous view, but here, infrastructure took off, right? This was supposed to be a very kind of mature market that hadn't really grown significantly in many years. We called it the perfect storm back in 2018, as everything seemed to line up: technology refreshes, economic conditions. But it was also the first time that we saw how infrastructure technologies were being used differently at a broader market level, right? Again, a lot of that being led by cloud. So let's move on to the next. We talked about cloud, or just mentioned cloud. But who will build the metaverse, I think, is an important question that we need to think about, right? Now, everybody will probably contribute or participate, right? It could happen in enterprise, it can happen anywhere. Here we have a forecast of compute infrastructure by different, mostly service provider types, and of course, enterprise, non-service providers. And if you look at this forecast, this is the total market forecast. You can kind of see we're already at a point where the hyperscalers, cloud service providers, digital service providers are already consuming about half of the total server infrastructure, compute infrastructure spend. And that's only going to grow significantly over the next 5 years. So while, like I said, everyone will participate, it does seem likely that the public cloud platform providers are going to be some key contributors in terms of building out the metaverse and investing in various metaverse technologies. So next, kind of, I didn't really word this as a question, but think about, well, what is it going to be built on? What is the metaverse, or within what technologies will it be built? And we don't have an official metaverse forecast, infrastructure forecast yet. Hopefully soon. But we do have an AI and accelerated infrastructure forecast, and at this point, I think it's becoming clear that this is the context within which the metaverse will be built. So you can see kind of the AI forecast in the top left, growing to about 26, maybe 27, almost $27 billion within the next few years. That's, again, infrastructure spend, server spend. And increasingly, as you can see on the right side, it's going to be accelerated servers within that context, right? So up to about 70%. And then you can see again in the pie chart how cloud is going to make up more than half of that infrastructure in terms of where it's deployed. So, again, cloud comes up no matter how you look at this. Cloud seems to always come up as a common, I guess, area of investment for metaverse. And so as a bonus, while it's not official yet, I don't have an official published forecast. I did come up with some rough estimates with some very broad assumptions that, given some of the assumptions we have, some of the baseline infrastructure views that we have of the market today, within the next really 3 years, metaverse infrastructure supporting the metaverse could reach about $2.5 billion, which is about 10% of the AI infrastructure, and that would put it at about an 85% CAGR. So that's a lot. It's a lot of spending, a lot of infrastructure growth, and fast growth. We'll see how it actually plays out over the next few years, but I think it's I figured it was fun to put a number up there that we could say was going to be metaverse infrastructure. So maybe that becomes the official forecast in a couple months, but we'll see. And so one other thing I wanted to point out, I think on the next slide, Cliff. So we talk about metaverse at IDC, and we also talk about Web3, and we think these are really intertwined. So really quickly, Web3 is, we define this as kind of this collection of open technologies that are geared towards shifting focus kind of onto the user community in terms of decentralizing control of data, things like that, right? We talk about data privacy and data sovereignty, all kinds of different things for years. So Web3 is kind of this movement towards having platforms that do decentralize that control. of data. So we do believe that Metaverse and Web3 are going to, of course, they're going to develop in parallel, but I do think they're going to be strongly linked, that one will build off of the other for a lot of the use cases that we end up seeing. So with that, I think we'll move to Metaverse transformation, and I'll hand it over to John.
Hey, thank you, Kuba. So yet another definition on what is the Metaverse. This one came about in partnership with student team at University of Arizona. But they talk about this future of the internet where we can live, work, play in this realm that's expansive, unified, shared, persistent, self-sustaining, up to fully immersive. But what I wanted to share instead, or beyond this, is an experience that I had in Palo Alto 3 or 4 years ago at the Institute for the Future, where I did put on VR glasses, and I found myself teleported to these alleyways in China. And as you looked around, the sound kind of conformed to where action was happening in that environment I was in. And if you went up and down, your field of view adjusted accordingly. And as I was there, my mind was in China, even though I was in Palo Alto physically. An avatar popped up and he said, "John, follow me. I filmed these sequences and I'm going to take you around and show you the alleyways here and tell you what's going on." And I followed him, and it turned out that the person I was interacting with was actually calling in from Nairobi, Africa. And what was really fascinating to me in that experience is we were both mentally sharing a different reality than the people in the rooms we were physically in. And while this experience was only 10 minutes and 3 or 4 years ago, it was really quite profound and made me think about notions of transmission of presence. What does it mean to be somewhere? Why do you get on a plane, and why don't you get into a plane? And this post-COVID era, with kind of more challenging situations in travel, it really is giving me a lot of thought in terms of how this will evolve to enable experiences that aren't possible today. And then just one point, I described a use case that was virtual reality, but realized there's a spectrum of continuity, which we'll talk about in a few slides. But if we can advance to the next one, please. This is another framing I really like, inspired in conversations with a technologist at Intel. At this point, he was talking about ambient computing on the far right a few years back, but he talks about these eras of compute where we went to compute for many decades, and we still do. We still go to the keyboard, but notably in the 2000s, with the advent of the smartphone, we started carrying compute with us. And then, as we enter the 2020s and beyond, we're entering this era where increasingly we're going to be surrounded by compute. So, one representation in my mind of Metaverse can be, you don't have any glasses at all. You're basically, maybe you're in a room where sensors are reading your motion and understanding your presence in the room and what you might want to do. I've seen some startup innovation where an operating system literally projects on a large desk, and you can actually code by using your hand and moving things and connecting things in a collaborative way with people in different parts of the world. So, there's a really wide gamut of user interface possibilities there that are going to drive compute from the edge through networking through the data center. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Alan.
Thank you, John. So I love when John say we're surrounded by computer, right? So as a regular consumer, you can imagine we're carrying phones, there's smart billboards and those sensors in any given places. But as an IT infrastructure, all this has to have a data center behind it, right? So as we're immersive into more digital devices around us as a consumer, the data center is actually growing bigger and bigger, right? So one of the things that the Metaverse IT infrastructure challenges, can we definitely infinitely building data center around the world? I don't think that's reasonable. So the power and the sustainability become really a big challenge, right? So we want to be carbon neutral. We want to consume as much as computing power, but at the same time, we want to make sure it's actually going to be not consuming a lot of energy from our data center. So low carbon, liquid cooling, those are the things that has been a lot of discussion in the OCP, and then all the hyperscaler digital service provider are trying to actually figure out a way to actually do something like that. And the next challenge is like the latency of speed, right? And when everyone talk about latency, the first initial thought was networking, right? We want to have higher speed networking from the 10 gig to the 25 gig to even 100 gig and 400 gigs, right? But one of the also things that as a system builder, we want to make sure our system is actually providing enough juice to that networking infrastructure, right? So DDR5, PCIe Gen 5, and CXL is coming from all the different silicons. I think that's really important to actually provide a more efficient and more powerful system at the system level, so the networking infrastructure actually can consume that as well. And then, of course, edge networking has been a very, very big topic as well. We want to be close to the IT infrastructure, as close as the consumer where that is. So other than like different social networking or the current business model that a lot of hyperscaler was doing right now, is we are talking about like real digital lives of ourselves in a real world. So those require a lot of inferencing at the edge side, and I think that's important as one of the conversation. And then of course, last one, we want to have more compute and power and performance, and that does require different thinking of how the system should be built, right? We have standard PCI boxes for enterprise, and then a lot of hyperscalers are still designing something a little bit different. So how this AI acceleration computing is gonna fit into this? So those are the interesting topic to talk about, and then of course those are the challenges that we have to foresee down the path. So with that being said, I will turn it back to John again to talk about other devices that build the infrastructure of the metaverse.
Thank you, Alan. This slide is basically, kind of showing the gamut of range in terms of immersiveness for metaverse. So, augmented reality is the idea that certain digital content can be projected over what's otherwise a physical setting that you see. Mixed reality allows you to manipulate digital objects in connection with kind of also, still not shutting you out of the real physical world. And then all the way to the right, virtual reality, you're pretty much shut out of the real world and you're kind of experiencing a purely digital setting. I'll share that we've been looking at some research that suggests that augmented reality may be the front runner in terms of your ability to spend more meaningful time during your day in that mode. Virtual reality is very immersive, but some studies show that after a few minutes for some people it becomes difficult to carry on for different reasons. But augmented reality allows you to leverage that technology. Let's say as you go and walk through a store where information that's helpful to your shopping experience can be projected over the kind of the physical objects in the store aisle, for example. So if we can move to the next slide, please. And this next one talks about some of the basic services that we can envision might be necessary for this build out of this metaverse concept. So discoverability. So if you bring a device, let's say you have an augmented reality glasses and you walk into a supermarket or a home goods store, and you want those glasses to interact with the store's environment to maybe help you price compare features on two products. Well, first, your glasses need to discover that the store has that capability. The store needs to know, that these glasses arrived in order to service it. So what's this notion of how does a device discover other devices in the area so that it can start interacting with them? And interoperability is the idea of, if you do buy something in some digital ecosystem, can it be utilized in a different ecosystem? So is it going to transfer from one platform to another, or are we going to see more walled gardens where if you invest on some assets in one particular metaverse, you cannot leverage them in a different metaverse? So I think for many of us, we prefer an open outcome, but I think it's hard to tell yet if we're going to see some few small, kind of vertical walled gardens or more open setting emerge. And in compatibility, think of it as all these devices interacting with each other, orchestrating security. you wouldn't want to have 3 glasses to take to 3 different stores because they use 3 different kind of protocols, right? So you want to make sure that these devices can all interact, work in a common way across different environments. And then the last one is thinking about these digital worlds. How will they be created? How will that content be managed? How will it be governed, both from an end user and from a developer perspective? So I think we're going to see a lot of, companies and innovation in the space of managing that content, including using AI to generate some of that content, because some of that content can be very labor intensive for graphic artists to create. Next page, please. This is also another kind of breakdown, and it was credit goes in partnership with University of Arizona student team that I work with, and we kind of struck up this notion of thinking about these different layers of the metaverse. So the experience layer is what we will connect with most readily. So it's the front end. It's what we see and experience directly. And as you move into the middle column, you have the platform who's providing it. So there's a security layer that manages security accounts, software APIs, orchestrates the compute, kind of orchestrates multi-device synchronization, and so on. And at the very end, of course, it's going to take enormous compute from cloud to networking to edge. As one Intel exec spoke at a conference, he made a comment that struck me, and he said, this is a journey. It's going to take a while to get there. He said, for example, we're not even able to do metaverse with 2 people talking to each other in a high fidelity visual way yet. So this is kind of a long cry from being able to, kind of the vision of maybe a lot of people in a concert sharing an experience. So we're going to get there, but by his estimate, it may take 1,000x the compute we have today to pull it off, and it's going to drive compute across the board. From colo, closer presence for latency reasons, some edge computation and AI across the board, all the way up to the cloud. So lots of compute, as Alan also kind of discussed earlier in his slide. So with that, I'd like to turn it back to Alan.
Yeah, thank you, John. So I think this is a different kind of view, but pretty much talking about the same thing as John was describing, right? So on the very top, the metaverse type is pretty much what John was describing as an experience layer. And we kind of talk about gaming, entertainment. Those are the areas that has a lot of investment going to. But as we see from a system vendor point of view, right, we see a lot of educational, industrial is also buying the equipment, right? They try to build a metaverse around it, and I definitely think those are the area that will have a lot of investment going into as well. And then as far as for the platform layer, there's going to be 5 pillars of the technology of the metaverse, and those are, I would think, are pretty much counting on the cloud service provider, the hyperscaler, or whoever own the software stack to actually to contribute to all this. Right? As a IT infrastructure vendor, I think one of the really key difference between right now and 5 years ago is we used to talk about just compute, storage, and networking, and a lot of emphasis on simply just a compute. But as the metaverse comes in, I think the system security and AI has become 2 of the very important ingredients that everyone is start talking about and become like one of the really key infrastructure requirement. As you can imagine, like we have a lot of privacy, a lot of data, identity stuff was storing in this metaverse, right? It's a duplication of me, myself. And then we want to make sure all this system, all this data was securely preserved in the data center infrastructure. And of course, AI, John kind of referenced, right? We need 100 or 1,000 times or more compute. And then how does those work? And can the simple compute just simply work out the infrastructure that we need? Or do we definitely need AI or acceleration compute or graphic cards and things like that? Those are also the topic that has a lot of discussion going forward. All right, so let me, we do have an audience poll. So we're gonna turn it back to Cliff, and then we might do a little bit poll right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. And so we're going to ask the audience to help us a little bit. We're going to pop up a poll question, and we're going to try to understand when will the metaverse be rolled out from the perspective of the audience. And so hopefully the audience can see the poll question. And we can see the poll question. And then Kate, I think, will be able to share the results with us in a moment.
Yep, those results should be displaying for everybody.
Okay, so maybe Kuba, you can go ahead and let us know what you think. Is this what you were expecting?
I wasn't really sure what to expect, Cliff. So I guess, it kind of looks like we're a little bit evenly split between two categories mostly, right? Already investing in metaverse-related technologies and not having discussed anything. I guess that's really not too surprising, right? Not everybody is going to be thinking about the metaverse today. But obviously some companies are already trying to invest in various aspects of what we've defined here as kind of broadly speaking the metaverse. So yeah, I'm not terribly surprised. I think it's a good sign. I'll say this, right? So between those top two options, or the already investing and investing in the next couple of years, we're looking at more than half of our audience. So probably we've got a little bit of a biased sample of folks that are interested in metaverse on this call, but still, I think that's a good sign for the next few years.
Yeah, that's probably a little bit more than I expected around already investing, but good to see that that's there. John or Alan, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think Kuba captured it really well. I probably don't have anything to add there.
Okay, so with that, let's move on. And I think we're actually going to hear from Alan around what are some of the technologies that Inspur has already identified they have to invest in for the future in order to make the metaverse work.
Absolutely. Thank you, Cliff. So this is a continuing investment and commitment to the innovation, right? As a system vendor, like I mentioned, I think latency is become really critical as building in the metaverse. So we kind of talk about PCIe Gen 5 and things like that. And I put it on the storage specifically because in the open compute, right, there's a lot of discussion about how do we provide low latency storage closer to the end user. And with the NVMe devices become PCIe protocol and then start taking advantage of PCIe Gen 5, I think that's become a critical changing point or turning point for a lot of storage designs around it. So right now, I think we have a Poseidon project working with Samsung and then contributed to OCP, and we continue to have a Poseidon V2. It's going to be a very comprehensive design going forward for low latency storages. And as far as for the compute, I think I kind of mentioned about liquid cooling, right? I do understand most of the people on the OCP community pay a lot of attention to the hyperscaler, right? Those are the greatest and the latest technology that's broadcast in the industry or community today. But you have to think about not all the people in the community can consume specialized hardware. So what we try to innovate is actually on the standard 1U and 2U pizza boxes. What can we do, right? What kind of innovation can we put it on to overcome some of the challenges we see altogether? For instance, like the carbon carbon neutral, and then also the power consumption and all that. So we're gonna adapting a lot of different air cooling solutions, right? EVA, heatsink, and liquid cooling to make sure our enterprise grade server is actually capable of competing with some of the hyperscaler design as well. So once you go into liquid cooling, I think the design become very similar in terms of the power consumption and then power transformation and things like that. So last one, I think we have to talk about metaverse without not talking about acceleration computing, right? But the challenge today, I think, is the framework has been changing every time, right? I could be talking to one of the customer 3 months ago, and then they love one of the framework they were working on, and then some of the topology. But the next day, well, today, turning in 3 months, when I was talking to them again, they might have a different strategy again. So I think as far as for my perspective goes, like the framework is actually the real wild, wild west. There's a lot of different interpretation to how that software stack is going to work out. And then as a system vendor, the only thing I can do is actually make sure my server is versatile and flexible enough to meeting all the different topology. And I think in OCP community, there's a lot of different vendors out there. They are doing a lot of different things, and I think that that's really great news for the community, because the technology, as long as it's flexible and then there's a lot of competition, I think that brings the best out of us, of everyone. And I think I'm really excited about that. And then I think everyone should be able to enjoy that as well. So that's a continuing investment. I'll turn it to Kuba to talk about some of the stuff that IDC has seen as well.
Thank you, Alan. So I won't go into too much detail with everything that's listed on this slide. I will say, so I borrowed this from some of my colleagues from a report called the Enterprise Metaverse. So I'll do a shout out real quick to my colleagues, Tom Manelli, Rick Villers, Amy Loomis, and Jennifer Cook. They put this together as part of a larger report. And really what I want to say is, just looking at this, right? So I mentioned cloud before as a place where a lot of this stuff is deployed. And I know we've had this discussion about kind of the variety of places and types of deployments. And you think about, what are the products and platforms that are going to support the metaverse, right? That's not just hardware. Like, of course, I'm an infrastructure guy. I talk about hardware and maybe system infrastructure software, things like that. But really, it's a combination of kind of the infrastructure, the hardware, software, and not just infrastructure, right? All kinds of software platforms that are going to enable the metaverse, and then services as well, right? So it's kind of you got to think about the whole spectrum. And even this list of products here, you kind of, you can see, there are a bunch of software platforms. There's, at least one design and simulation platform that's hardware and software. There's services here, interfaces, right? AR, VR probably being the major or main interface that we usually think about for metaverse. But I'd like to kind of, also kind of point out, or kind of harken back to what John said about interoperability and compatibility. You've got this variety, like this is just a short list for today, right? And this list will just get longer and longer as we go forward. I think, the way I would phrase it is, it could be a lot of closed gardens and it could be open, but I think open would be best. And I think that's probably what we would agree on here, that, open infrastructure, open platforms, kind of also maybe in the spirit even of Web3, right, where data becomes decentralized, or control of data becomes decentralized as a part of it, but also right in terms of the design, right, which is an OCP tenet as well. So I think that would be, in the grand scheme of things, the best path forward to kind of getting as much out of the metaverse and maybe into the metaverse as possible over the next years and perhaps decades to come. So that's my I'll stop there with that hope for how these products continue to develop over the next several years.
Well, thank you, Kuba. And as we transition over to Alan to talk a little bit about product, I just want to remind everyone that we are going to be opening the live Q&A in a little while. So if you have questions for anyone, please go ahead and enter them now. Now's a good time to get your questions in. And Alan, over to you.
Yeah, sure. So thank you, Cliff, and thank you, Kuba. So I'm gonna spend very quick talk about what I think about open compute, and then why we having this seminar is not only just because Inspur has all this product, but we are committed ourselves, right, to the openness of it. So all the product right here, the edge computing, the Poseidon, and then the AI innovation is actually surrounding just open, right? I think John and Kuba described it really good, right? We have to have a standard. Right now, I'm thinking about the way that all this AI gear is becoming like the Apple ecosystem and Android ecosystem, right? They can simply agree on the connector right now, right? How do you charge your phone? And then for a consumer like myself, we have to bring all these different devices because simply we have to, all the devices that we bought ourselves. So this one is we feel like the edge computing with the GPU is going to be important, but we want to throw it out there to make sure the community sees it. And then once the community sees it, once we have feedback from the end user and the customer or different competition out there, right, that really bring the best out of us. So we just want to throw it out there as an idea or the concept or a product, and then we just continue to innovate it on it, right? So it kind of goes to my previous slide, say the continued innovation, right? It didn't stop right here. And then the concept, the product that we bring into the community might not necessarily be the final product that a lot of end user will consume by 5 years from today. And of course, the Poseidon V1 is going to be a low latency product. It's available right now, and you can actually purchase that and then starting your low latency experience on the Metaverse as well. And of course, AI product, we have a lot of AI innovation on top of it. And I think as a starting ground, those are enterprise grade, and then you can actually simply get a unit and then start testing it out and then start your journey on the Metaverse. With that being said, I'll turn it back to Kuba. So see how the enterprise, how they access the Metaverse.
Thank you, Alan. So yeah, I'll just spend a couple of minutes on a few points here. In terms of this question again of how the enterprise is going to access the metaverse, clearly cloud is going to be one on-ramp, right? Certainly, and we have some survey data on the right side of this chart that shows kind of some of the perhaps kind of baby steps towards metaverse types of services that are already being used by enterprise customers today. And then I'll borrow again from my colleagues that I mentioned earlier from the Enterprise Metaverse report. There are a few things I want to point out here, right? So we talk about the benefits to the enterprise, right? So a big one is going to be how employees are going to interact, collaborate. We'll be able to kind of leverage metaverse technology to enhance things like R&D, perhaps, right? So there's a lot of ways that we can continue to build. Each enterprise can build on top of this technology to create some value and actual value for their business. From an adoption point of view, again, this is early days. So right now, I think the best thing we have as a guidepost is our AR VR forecast, kind of the whole ecosystem forecast. Again, this is hardware, software, services. I don't believe it includes infrastructure in that estimate, but it's the actual AR hardware gear and all the ecosystem surrounding it. So looking at about $45 billion worth of investment in about 3 years from now. So definitely a lot of investment in time, money. Certainly based on our poll today, it looks like there's a lot of interest and effort being put forth already. And I think, going back again to kind of the risks, right? What are the risks of, kind of metaverse not coming to fruition the way that we've kind of envisioned it here today and obviously elsewhere? And I think that's really, it kind of comes back to that, again, kind of part of that Web3 story, that open story. If the metaverse development can continue in an open fashion, where we can work on these problems of being able to connect all these different platforms and solutions to really custom fit the tools that we build for specific use cases, then I think that's the environment in which metaverse will thrive. And I think kind of participating in it will be a good investment for everybody. If we don't have that openness of data, resource sharing, open standards, everybody's going to essentially reinvent the wheel for themselves, then you're going to get to see these silos that are less than efficient from a user perspective, and really not easily transferred from one to another. So that's the risk, I think, and not that I want to end on a bad note, but I think, you know, that's kind of, again, looking forward, that's one of these goals that we should be working towards. So with that, I think we can wrap it up, and I'll send it back over to Cliff.
Well, thank you, Kuba. And now we're going to open it up for some audience Q&A, and we've got a couple of really good questions that have come in. The first is around security, and you know, what's it really going to take to secure the metaverse? And I know at the OCP we have several projects on security, looking at security from the ground up, really, all the way out to the user. So from the equipment, you know, can we have a single hardware root of trust, so we know a device and know we can trust it? The firmware, is that trusted? Is it? Can we be sure that when we load a piece of firmware, we're not introducing Trojan horse or anything else? Moving outwards, there's the networking level, and then of course there's the device. How do we know the device is secured, not being compromised? And after that, what about the person? How do we identify people? Where are we going to go with this? And so I'd like to open this up to some speculation from John and Alan and Kuba. So who would like to bite that one off a little bit first?
I'll raise one you know, kind of narrow spectrum of conversations I've been in. It certainly doesn't address the comprehensiveness of the question, but when we think about security, you know, by tradition, the account management is owned by the particular company. Like if you log into one metaverse, maybe I have an account ID and a password there. Now I go to a different metaverse or a different platform, and now I have a different account and password managed there. But what about the notion of kind of a decentralized account management that kind of notions of Web3 and NFT might enable, where now I recontrol my security and I have my account to, you know, kind of identify that I am who I am, and I can choose what data to expose to whom for how long and when. So those are some kind of questions we've been percolating here. I recognize that comment is just touching a narrow aspect of security, but I thought I would share it out.
Yeah, I'll add something to what John was saying, right? So on Web3, I think it's definitely going to be one of the things that a lot of people are talking about, and for privacy reasons and security reasons, right? On a platform level, I think OCP, like Clay was saying, right, there's a lot of discussion about how do we control the system level. And then there's modularized components kind of idea about this right now is how do we make sure, hey, all the active IC, right, or like the BMC, the control board, right, they can actually be modularized, something called DCSCM. And then so you get actually kind of have not given the supplier such as us have the control of the module and then have a black box of the firmware, right, attached to it. So you have to run through the validation for a really long time as a consumer or like hyperscaler, right? And then, you know, sometimes you just don't find those critical area like when you are running a validation for a period of time. And another one is actually make sure the open source software stack, right? It's available for the firmware stack, right? So a lot of discussion about open BMC, open up the BMC, and then for the BIOS portion of it, there's native boot and all these different things. So we want to give all this control back to the one who is providing the services. And then we want to make sure it's exposed and open enough, like everyone can review, right? Peer review on the codes and things like that. So make sure there's no loophole. And then potentially, yeah, a text comes in, right? The hyperscaler or the digital service provider, they can patch that right away, right? Instead of waiting for the vendor like us to run through like a really long life cycle, right? Maybe a couple months in order to release a firmware to block that attack. So they can actually respond really quick immediately instead of waiting for a cycle like a supplier like us to actually to do it. So I think that will help to solidify the security. And then once the attack was happening, there's a way to actually stop it right away. So I think that's the concept on the what we OCP was discussing right now.
So I'll just add my 2 cents. I'll go back to the thing I said about risk, right? I didn't mention security, at least not directly. But I think over a long, decades now, we see infrastructure technology complexity growing, the reach of technology with edge IoT growing exponentially, and with that you get, I guess really continued exponential increases in security risk through just a much larger attack surface and many more vectors of attack. So security is one of those things, and I'm not a security expert, but security is one of those things that it just has to be at the core design level of any solution going forward. Because if you're going to try to, and I don't mean patch as in like a firmware patch, but if you're going to try to patch, so to speak, an entire platform or entire solution after the fact by saying, oh, let's put a cover on it, that's not going to work, right? You can't put a cover on something that's going to be a huge distributed system using multiple technologies, right? So things like root of trust, distributed security. I mean, you're going to get things like blockchain technologies probably having a role in maintaining security. And it's really going to be a bottoms up effort, I think, or has to be, of building in some of the core secure technologies, again, to enhance your security. You're never going to be 100% secure. And then, as you go up the stack, continue to layer on different aspects of, threat management, risk management, response. All that I think comes into play. It's pretty much everybody from a security perspective is on alert, so to speak.
Yes, well, that's good that someone asked a security question because it's always so important. And somehow I find on webinars, we tend to gloss over it too much. The next question that came in is also pretty important, and we touched on it slightly, but we're being asked, is there any way we can dive a little bit more deeply into some of the ways in which we're really going to provide that immersive experience? And, is there new product coming? How do we deal with the latency? I don't know, John, if you can talk a little bit about some of the talks that you've been having at Intel around how really are we going to service this new rollout of equipment and meet the new requirements. Some stuff on the drawing board that you can share with us without violating any NDAs.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole spectrum of things there. So, I mean, we're seeing the device makers of glasses. They're improving very rapidly your field of view and kind of the fidelity. So that's moving pretty quickly. I think 5G, rollout of 5G is going to help work some of the latency issues, maybe not entirely resolve them, but it's gonna play a big role. I think seeing more edge compute, kind of the continuation of Moore's law, which Intel and others are investing significantly. We still see line of sight of continuing to drive innovation in Moore's law for I would say 10 years even. It's getting harder, but there's still a path forward. We haven't exhausted that. I think seeing more kind of domain-specific architectures to kind of complement, core CPUs, kind of in chiplet and heterogeneous, will allow us to pack more and more compute and better user experience in smaller form factors at increasingly lower cost than before. So I think we're going to continue seeing innovation there across the spectrum. It may be that colos and kind of play a broader function with compute that's a little bit closer to where you are in order to also further address latency. I think it's a combination of all of the above.
I'm so happy you talked about chiplets because I wanted to work it into the discussion somewhere that And for those people who don't know what a chiplet is, because many people don't still, it's the idea that instead of creating one huge silicon wafer that's in an integrated circuit, we actually stitch together a number of smaller wafers, creating one integrated circuit, where each wafer could be from different process node sizes and require, therefore, getting better yields. And in fact, there's a whole discussion about, for the silicon world, moving away from the integrated circuit is the next economy or the next market going to be the chiplet market, where we're going to have system integrators that bring together different chiplets from different vendors and create new integrated circuits. And it's also an area of very active interest within the OCP. So we do believe that that's going to be one of the ways that we're going to get past some of the limitations of Moore's law. Does anyone else want to add anything after John about some of the things we need to do? Otherwise, there's another good question that came in. Okay, well, the next question is actually one that I didn't expect to get. And the question here is, when we think about quantum computing, how's that going to factor into the metaverse? And I'll leave that open for anyone who wants to bite that off.
I did do some reading on quantum computing for a while there. I think that one is still out quite a ways, you know, maybe 10 or 20 years. So for example, quantum computers today are approaching 100 qubits. You know, kind of these bits are these fundamental elements of quantum. And by some estimates, we'll need over 1 million qubits to do like really useful work that might exceed what a HPC classic computer does today. The other thing is, quantum computing is really, really, really good at a certain set of narrow problems. So I can envision it surfacing as an accelerator of sorts. So you have your general purpose compute and it's running and running and running, and then you get to this kind of complex problem that as you add parameters, it keeps doubling in complexity. And there are certain problems that map really well to quantum computing, where as the domain space keeps doubling, the time to compute doesn't. So it can just really crank through, you know, infinite number of possibilities, provide the result back to the main kind of general purpose compute that kind of keeps moving the algorithm. There are some quantum optimization systems like quantum annealing by D-Wave, which are geared towards like optimizing certain types of problem sets. If you have certain types of formulas, it can find a kind of the minimum or a minima. But there's a lot of interesting progress there. And beyond quantum computing, there's quantum transmission of data, which ties back to security. So the field is moving, but the true quantum computing still has a ways to go.
Anyone else want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with John. So quantum computing has quite a ways to go, I think, and I do like the kind of the frame of thinking of a quantum computer as this ridiculously huge accelerator, right, for specific purposes. And yeah, I think I didn't really think about it this way, but you know, from a modeling and simulation perspective, yeah, for certain problems, quantum computing does does have a great potential to contribute to that. So from that aspect of it, yes, I don't think it'll be an aspect in gaming, for example, but who knows, you know. Don't hold me to that one, because 10 years from now somebody's going to come up with a quantum gaming computer and I'm going to just like retire. But yeah, I do think there's going to be certain use cases down the road where quantum is going to play a major role, and I think we're really just scratching the surface of what we can do with quantum technologies overall. So it's a good question.
Okay, well, that brings us to the top of the hour. And so I wanted to thank the panelists for their time today, and the audience for listening. And for those of you that didn't hear me at the beginning, this has been recorded and will be available on demand. And for anyone that did register but didn't make it here today, we'll let them know that they can listen on demand. So thanks again, everyone, and till the next webinar in our series.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.